Earth remained silent until the galaxy Council crossed the line of contempt. The identification band cut into my wrist every time I moved. It was made of a pale blue polymer, thin as paper, engraved with a 6-digit code the Vorath had assigned to me on my first day aboard Salin Prime. Every human who entered the station wore one. It was not a security measure. It was not a visitor pass. It was simply the most efficient way the Galaxy Council had found to communicate without ever using the words that we belonged to a category slightly below the people who made the rules and slightly above the equipment used to enforce them. I was Ambassador Kale Voss, Senior Diplomatic Representative of Earth, the third human to hold the position in the longest serving 11 years on that station, 11 years with a number on my wrist like a luggage tag. The main chamber of Sen Prime was carved into the heart of the station, a wide, circular space with a transparent ceiling through which you could watch the stars, not the ordinary view you got from a porthole, but the full slow arc of the galaxy's arm, white ribbons of light curving across the dark in long, patient sweeps that made everything happening below seem very small. It was one of the most genuinely beautiful things I had ever seen in my life. I had stopped letting myself feel that beauty a long time ago. Beauty was a distraction, and I could not afford distractions in that room. The 7 species of the Galaxy Council occupied 7 curved tiers of seating rising from the chamber floor in concentric rings. The Vorath sat at the highest tier. They always sat highest. They were tall beings, angular and precise, with dark shell-like plates across their shoulders and 3 sets of limbs, the upper pair used for communication and gesture, the lower 4 for movement. Their faces had the stillness that all creatures with an external casing have. No visible change in expression to read. But their eyes were golden and very sharp, and they tracked everything in the room without appearing to move. Below them sat the Sonori, lean, gray-skinned, deeply intelligent in a way that made you feel slightly examined whenever they looked at you. The Sonori communicated in standard council speech when they wanted to be understood by others among themselves. They used deep resonance, a form of directed frequency that operated below the range of hearing and could carry full complex communication with no outward sign. They used it to influence votes. They used it to apply pressure on delegates who showed signs of disagreement. They had been doing this for decades quietly with enormous effectiveness, and until 6 years ago, no human had known it was happening. We knew now. We had known for 6 years. We had chosen to say nothing and to prepare instead. The other 5 council species filled the remaining tiers. The Theo broad-shouldered amphibians with large reflective eyes, who had been trading with humanity longer than any other species and who had never once been offered a fair trade agreement. The Murin heavy and deliberate, whose home world sat inside a Vorath-controlled fuel corridor and who therefore voted as the Vorath wished in every session that mattered. The Dravathi, who were among the most gifted engineers in the known galaxy, but whose technology development had been quietly strangled for 30 years by council licensing systems designed to ensure they remained dependent rather than competitive. The solely small and communal and careful, who were afraid of almost everything in that chamber and experienced this as a reasonable response to the available evidence. And The Cath who I had never once heard speak aloud during an open session in 11 years of attendance. Then there was the human delegation. We sat not in a tier at all, we sat in a row of 6 chairs on the chamber floor below the lowest tier. At the level of the speaking podium, the observation seat it was called, we were present, we were not participants, we did not vote, we could not introduce motions, we did not speak unless directly addressed by a council member. And no council member had directly addressed us in the previous 4 consecutive. I sat in the leftmost chair. Beside me was Dr. Nora Ellison, who held the title of Chief Xenolinguist and had spent 7 of her 11 years on the station, teaching herself the Vorith private command dialect, a linguistic achievement that no one in the council believed was possible, and therefore no one in the council had thought to worry about. Next was Owen Hart, listed as trade liaison, who was in practical terms the operational mind of everything our delegation actually did. Then Philip Crane, whose listed role was medical attach and whose actual skill was systems analysis of a depth and precision that would have unsettled several Dravathi academics if they had ever been shown his work. Then Lena Marsh, cultural observer by title, gravitational physicist by training, the person most responsible for a specific set of technical capabilities he, the council, had no knowledge of. And finally Callum Price, 28 years old, my personal aide officially, and the finest memory I had ever encountered in a human being unofficially. 6 humans in chairs on the floor with numbered bands on their wrists. The session that morning had been called without a formal agenda distribution. This was itself a violation of the council's own procedural charter, which required 7 days advanced notice for sessions involving policy review. We had received a single line notification 14 hours before the chamber doors opened. It said only that the matter of human colonial expansion requests would be reviewed, nothing else. No sub-items, no supporting documentation, no list of presenting delegations. I had known from the moment I read those words exactly what was coming. Vale Dorth had been High Chancellor for 22 years, by the standards of his species and his political class. He was considered a moderate. I found this remarkable. In 22 years of sharing a chamber with the human delegation, he had never once looked directly at one of us during a formal session. We occupied the same room, breathed the same recycled station air, listened to the same translated proceedings through the same council issued earpieces, and to Veal Doroth we were consistently, completely invisible, not ignored in the active sense, the way you ignore something you have considered and chosen not to engage with. Invisible in the passive sense, the way furniture is invisible, present, functional to the extent of its purpose, and of no further interest. He opened the session without ceremony. He spoke in formal High, and my translation unit rendered his words in a flat, effectless tone that suited the content perfectly. The petition submitted by the human colony on Vesta 7 for expanded mining rights in the outer corridor had been reviewed. He said it had been reviewed by the Resource Allocation Committee, the Boundary Standards Committee, and the Colonial Affairs Review Board. All 3 bodies had returned the same finding. Denied. The reasons were listed in sequence. Human technology had not met the minimum standard required for outer corridor operations. The colonial Population at Vesta 7 had not demonstrated the civic maturity required for autonomous resource governance. And this was the remark that arrived in the chamber like a piece of equipment dropped from height. The council had determined that expanding human operational range at this time would create unnecessary instability in a region already requiring careful management. Unnecessary instability. 40,000 people, miners and engineers and teachers and children and families who had spent 18 months preparing a petition, filing the paperwork, paying the fees, wading through the proper channels, and been told that their presence in the galaxy was a problem that needed to be managed. I kept my face exactly as still as I had trained it to be. There was a pause after the chancellor finished. Some Vorath delegates exchanged brief gestures. Murin delegate activated a personal recording device. The Sonori were still. The Thiel delegation, I noticed with the particular quality of attention I had been developing for 11 years, did not move at all. Not a small movement, not a minor adjustment of posture, complete stillness, the kind that in Thiel behavior indicated that something had been registered as significant and was being held. Then Veal-Doroth said something that was not in his prepared remarks. I knew it was not prepared because I had a copy of his prepared remarks. I had obtained them 2 days before the session through means that the council's security apparatus had not yet imagined were possible. He leaned slightly forward at the high tier and said in a tone that was almost conversational, almost kind, in the way that a person is kind when they are explaining something they find very simple to someone they consider not very sharp, that perhaps it would be useful to revisit the question of whether the observation seat itself remained a productive accommodation, that Earth's presence in the chamber had been extended as a courtesy. That courtesy, he said, was not a permanent arrangement. He did not look at me. He finished, turned to the delegate beside him, and began a private exchange as if the chamber were already empty and everyone in it had already gone home. I sat in my chair and did not move and did not speak. The band pressed against my wrist. Nora was perfectly still. Me. It's awkward. Owen on my other side shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. It was a motion so small that it would have registered to anyone watching as nothing, a person adjusting their position in a chair as people do. But I had worked with Owen Hart for 9 years. I knew every way he moved in a chair. This particular motion was a question. I let 3 seconds pass, then I exhaled slowly and raised my right hand to adjust the collar of my jacket. That was the answer. At the far end of our row, Callum Price quietly picked up his data pad and began typing through the remainder of the session the same way I had sat through every session for 11 years, upright, attentive, still giving nothing away, taking everything in. When the chamber adjourned, I walked back to the human annex through the corridors that the station's designers had placed as far from the main transit routes as was architecturally possible, and I sat at my desk and opened my personal log and wrote in it the way I wrote in it. Every day I wrote about the session. I wrote about the denial. I wrote about the 40,000 people on Vesta 7. I wrote about Veal-Doroth's remark, the one that was not in his notes. I wrote about the precise quality of the Thiel delegation's stillness and what I thought it meant. Then I wrote, today they crossed it, the line we drew in Private 40 years ago. I closed the log, walked to the back wall of my office, pressed my palm to a panel that looked no different from the wall around it, spoke a phrase that I had memorized before I first set foot on the station, and had never spoken aloud to anyone, and opened the door that was not listed on any station schematic the council had ever reviewed. I walked through it. 40 years of silence, every year of it had been a calculation, not a surrender, not a weakness, not an acceptance of the treatment we received, a calculation. We had needed time, we had needed trade, access and medical technology, and the protection of the corridors while our outer colonies got strong enough to matter. We had needed the Voreth to continue underestimating us while we prepared things they did not know we were preparing. We had needed to sit in chairs on the floor and wear numbered bands and absorb 40 years of visible contempt without flinching, because flinching would have cost us everything, and patience would eventually cost us nothing. The 40 years were done. Door closed behind me without a sound. Owen Hart was waiting at the bottom of the corridor, jacket off, leaning against the wall. He had been there long enough to get comfortable. He had been comfortable since before I confirmed anything, because Owen usually arrived at conclusions slightly ahead of the evidence, not through guessing but through the kind of reading of small signs that 11 years in close quarters with a team like ours produced in a person of his particular intelligence. Philip has the room ready, he said, straightening. How long has Philip had the room ready? About 6 hours. He started when Callum flagged the session. Notice, we walked together down the subtle corridor, past 3 doors that led to storage spaces registered to neutral species commercial operators, and 1 door that led to the actual subdeck. The subdeck was not visible on any structural schematic of the human annex. It had been built into the station's infrastructure over 4 years, 1 carefully planned modification at a time, each one classified as maintenance work under permits that were technically valid and practically invisible in the administrative noise of a station the size of Sin Prime. Philip Crane was at the head of the main table when we entered, and he had the particular stillness that meant he had already done his analysis and was waiting for confirmation so he could move to the next phase. Philip was the kind of person who became very quiet when he was working at full capacity in social settings. This made him seem unremarkable in operational settings. It made him formidable. Nora was at the table, already changed out of her formal attire, 3 translation matrices open. On screens in front of her, Lena Marsh stood at the far wall studying a gravitational map of the space surrounding the station. Callum was in the corner with his data pad, typing with the focused efficiency that he maintained for hours when there was something important to document. Was it open session or private corridor? Philip asked without preamble. Open session, I said on the record. Philip nodded once. Not a trial balloon, then a commitment. That was the exact right reading. Something floated as a private remark. Could be withdrawn, reframed, denied. Something stated in open formal session became part of the council's official record. Veal Doroth had put his government on record suggesting that human observer status was contingent and revocable. This was not a warning. It was the first procedural step of a process that, if allowed to run to completion, would end with Earth classified as non-affiliated outside the Council framework outside the traded. Agreements outside the protected. Medical exchange programs that 17 million people in Earth's outer colonies depended on for treatments that human pharmaceutical development had not yet independently replicated. The Vorath knew all of this. That was the precise and careful elegance of the move. It carried no overt aggression. It was bureaucratic. It was procedural. It created a crisis without ever drawing weapon. Show me current positioning, I said. Lena adjusted the gravitation map. 12 green indicators appeared at various points around the station, each labeled with the name of a commercial vessel registered to a neutral species trading operator. The manifests were in order. The transit permits were current. The captains had legitimate histories with companies that appeared in 3 different commercial registries across the neutral zone. None of those companies had ever moved actual cargo. All 12 holding at anchor, Lena said. Disruptors in passive mode, no query. Signals from station traffic control in the past 18 hours. They are as far as Sen Prime is aware, or freighters waiting for docking assignment. How long since the last one arrived? 9 days. It came in with the Dravathi supply convoy from outer station 6. Clean insertion. No attention. I looked at the map for a moment. 12 vessels positioned at gravitational anchor points around Sen Prime's jump corridor exits, each one carrying equipment built in a laboratory on the far side of Earth's moon by a team of engineers who had spent 7 years reading theoretical physics papers the Council had sold to humanity at what the Council considered a charity price. Educational materials, the invoice had called them. We would give the livestock something to look at. The logic presumably went, they would admire the mathematics and file them away. Somewhere we had not filed them away. We had read them, understood them, improved on them, and quietly distributed the resulting technology across 12 vessels registered to Shell, companies that did not technically exist. We had been moving those vessels into position for 9 months, one at a time, at intervals designed to attract exactly as much attention as ore freighters typically attracted, which was none. I need to show you something, Nora said, and her voice had the particular tone it carried when she had been waiting to deliver and had now determined the moment was correct. She brought up an audio file on the screen in front of her and a transcription beneath it. Private Vorath. Internal communication. This morning, 40 minutes before the session opened, she pressed play. The audio was in Vorath. Private command dialect. Not the formal register used in open sessions, which the Council translation units could render, but the internal language used by Vorath leadership for communications. They were certain no other species could follow. It was built on a phonetic register that required years of study to approach fluently, years of study that the Vorath had never once imagined human being would invest. Nora had invested 7 years. The exchange was between Veiled Dorath and his senior aide. The aide asked if the Chancellor expected a response from the human delegation to the review decision. The Chancellor said no. The aide asked about the remark regarding observer status. The Chancellor said it was time to begin the formal process, that the accommodation had served its purpose, that there was no strategic reason to maintain the appearance of inclusion for a species that contributed nothing to Council stability and whose presence in The chamber had only ever been a gesture toward political optics that the council no longer needed to perform. Then the aide asked a question, and the chancellor gave an answer that Nora had rendered in the same clean clinical translation she used for everything. The aide said, "They may object," the chancellor said. "Let them petition again in another century. Meat does not negotiate." Room held the silence for a moment. Callum had stopped typing. Owen was looking at the floor. Lena had not moved from the wall, but her expression had shifted from focus to something harder. Recorded 40 minutes before he walked into formal session. Philip said yes. Nora said, "That is useful," Philip said. Not in anger. Philip never processed contempt in anger. He processed it as material, as information, as something with weight and dimension that could be used to build something. He had been doing this for 9 years in that room, and he was very good at it. Owen looked at me. "You're ready to move to the dossier." The dossier had taken 11 years to build. It existed in 3 secure copies, one in the subdeck, one in an encrypted relay point in deep space, one in a vault on Earth. It contained the complete record of every procedural manipulation, every falsified threat assessment, every financial instrument and back-channel arrangement the Vorath had used to maintain their dominance over the council for 30 years. It contained communications between Vorath officials and Murin delegates that made the Murin bloc's voting record completely explicable and completely indefensible. It contained technical evidence of how Dravathi patent applications had been routed through council review processes designed to delay them long enough for Vorathaline technology corporations to file competing applications in the neutral licensing zones. And it contained the Sonori documentation, the full record of the resonance operations, the unauthorized mental pressure campaigns run against delegates the Vorath wished to influence, and the medical files of 3 Thiel delegates who had retired, citing health issues that were not health issues. This last section was the one I had spent the most time deciding how to deploy. The Sonori were in certain respects more unpredictable than the Vorath because their methods were less visible and their responses to exposure were harder to model. Releasing that documentation in open session without preparation could produce outcomes ranging from a formal denial and counter-accusation to something considerably less procedural. The neural shielding program had been our answer to that uncertainty. Every member of our 6-person delegation had been fitted with shielding technology developed from a combination of Sonori frequency research and human neurological engineering. The procedure was minor and left no external marker. We had done it over 18 months through appointments, logged as routine medical maintenance. If the Sonori attempted a resonance operation against any of us in the chamber, they would receive silence. They would not understand why. We had never given them reason to suspect the shielding existed. The dossier goes with me to the chamber, I said. It does not move before that. Owen nodded. Lena turned back to the map. Philip began arranging the data chipsets with his characteristic precision. The Secretary General's window is in about 4 hours, Callum said. He had resumed typing. Set it up, I said. Her face appeared on the secure screen 80 minutes later. Not 4 hours. She had been waiting. She was that kind of person. She asked me 3 Questions in the specific order. She always asked important questions, fast and direct, as if the questions themselves were taking up space she needed for what came after them. Was the fleet holding position? Was the dossier complete? Were the neural shields confirmed functional? Yes, yes, she was. Quiet for 4 seconds. Send the standing order, she said. I reached across the table and picked up the data card Philip had set in front of me. It was thin and plain and looked like nothing. It contained a single encoded transmission that, when sent to a specific relay point on a specific frequency, would activate the second phase of a plan 12 years in preparation. I held it in my hand and thought about nothing in particular, not because there was nothing to think about, because I had already done the thinking and it was complete and there was no useful thought left to add. I handed the card to Owen. He moved to the transmission panel outside in orbital space in the silent dark around Sen Prime. 12 vessels that had been sitting with the patience of things that do not feel impatient made a small and precise adjustment to their configuration. Their gravity disruptors moved from passive standby to active readiness, not aimed, not deployed, simply alive, simply present in a way they had not been before. No sensor on Solon Prime registered the change. No Vorath officer at any monitoring station saw anything to indicate that the 36 hours ahead were different from any other 36 hours in the 40 years of human presence in Council space. They did not look at the Freyers. They had never thought they needed to look at the Freyers. That was the thing about contempt. It was not free. It had a price, and the accounting was about to begin. I sat at the table in the subdeck and turned the identification band on my wrist once, slowly, the same way I had done at the end of every difficult day for 11 years. Not as an expression of anger, not as performance, as a private ritual of refusal, a small daily act of choosing not to stop noticing what was being done, even when noticing it was the only thing I could do. In 3 days that would change. The drawer doctrine had been named by a historian who never knew it existed. She had written in a paper on human strategic culture published 12 years ago and read by perhaps 300 people that the distinguishing feature of Earth's post-con diplomatic posture was what she called the drawer policy, the habit of preparing every possible response to every possible situation, filing it and waiting for the situation to arrive. She had meant it as mild criticism. She had observed correctly that Earth spent enormous resources preparing for scenarios that never materialized. What she had not known, because it was classified at a level above anything she could have accessed, was that the scenarios were not imaginary, and the drawer was not a metaphor. The drawer was a room beneath a station. The drawer was 12 vessels in orbital space. The drawer was 11 years of documentation in a sealed file with 3 copies in 3 locations. The drawer was Nora Ellison spending 7 years learning a language that no one believed she could learn, and Philip Crane building monitoring systems that no one believed he could build, and Lena Marsh applying gravitational physics that no one believed a human had read, let alone understood and improved upon. The Vorath had dismissed us because dismissal was the most efficient response to something you did not consider a threat. They had been doing this for 30 years with every species in their political orbit, and it had worked consistently because the species in their orbit had been kept through careful management in a state where they could not afford the cost of genuine opposition. The Murin needed the fuel. Corridor, the Drevi needed the licensing. Access, the Soli needed the protection. Agreements, the Thiel needed the trade. Routes, every species had a pressure point, and the Voreth had long since mapped and calibrated each one. What they had not mapped was us. They had not mapped us because mapping us would have required taking us seriously, and taking us seriously would have required acknowledging that we were something worth taking seriously, and that acknowledgement was incompatible with the category they had assigned us. We were the observation seat, we were the numbered bands, we were the polite fiction of inclusion maintained at negligible cost. The negligible cost was what had kept us safe, not safe from contempt, safe from attention. A species worth watching is a species you watch. Species too small to matter is a species you ignore, and a species you ignore can, over a decade, build things in the gaps of your attention that would have been impossible to build under your scrutiny. Philip had finished sorting the data chips by the time the Secretary General's face appeared on the secure screen, and he stepped away from the table to give the call the privacy it required, and did not need be, because Philip had already read every word that was going to be said in that call and could have answered the questions himself. He stepped away because there are forms that matter even when the substance is already decided, and Philip understood the forms as well as anyone in our delegation. I watched the Secretary General's expression as I answered her 3 questions. She was a person who had spent 30 years in difficult rooms making difficult decisions, and her face in the moments after hearing difficult information was the most controlled face I had ever seen on a human being. Not blank controlled. The difference was that a blank face has nothing behind it, and a controlled face has everything behind it, and the person behind it has decided very deliberately what to show. What she showed after I answered yes and yes was 4 seconds of something that looked like the specific kind of calm that arrives when a thing you have been holding in readiness for a long time is finally being called into use. Send the standing order. She thought about the 40 years, not my 11 years, the full 40, the people before me who had made the same calculation I had made in harder circumstances, with less preparation and less support, in sessions where the contempt was fresher and the response framework did not yet exist. The first human diplomat to sit in those chairs on the floor. The second, the ones who had come home with nothing and gone back again the next year, because going back again was what the calculation required. The ones who had died before the drawer was ready, and had known at the end that they would die before it was ready, and had done the work anyway because the work was not for them specifically. I thought about all of them when I handed Owen the data card. The transmission was 4 seconds long. 12 vessels in orbital space received it and began moving, and I sat in the subdeck of Sen Prime and turned the identification band on my wrist and thought about what it meant to have been invisible for exactly as long as you needed to be invisible, and then to choose on a specific Tuesday to be seen. I opened my log and began writing everything down, because the record mattered, because the texture of what 40 years of contempt looked like from inside it deserved to exist somewhere in complete and unfiltered form, and because when this was over somebody was going to want to know what it had actually been like to sit in those chairs and wait for the right moment and carry the weight of knowing that patience and surrender look identical. From the outside, I wanted there to be record that showed the difference. The morning of the session, I woke at 4 in the station's artificial dark cycle and lay still on my bunk for exactly 12 minutes. I had done this on the morning of every significant moment in my 11 years on Salon Prime, not to review plans, not to run calculations. Those were finished. I did it because I had learned that the mind requires a specific quality of quiet before an action it cannot reverse, a different quiet from sleep or rest, a quiet that is simply the experience of being present before the moment arrives. At 4:14, I got up, dressed in my formal diplomatic attire, and drank 2 cups of coffee standing at my desk without sitting down. Philip knocked at 4:40 and came in without waiting, which was our established protocol for mornings when the work was already beyond the stage of knocking and waiting. Everything is in order, he said. He set a small case on the desk. Inside were 6 data chips in individual sealed sleeves. Nora finished the final translation pass at 2 this morning. The full dossier is now formatted in standard council script and in Varath, Sonori, Thiel, and Murin native language renderings. Every document cross-referenced, every source cited. The notation system the council uses for its own official records. I picked up one of the chips. It was lighter than its significance deserved. The secondary package, I said. Owen has it pre-addressed to 3 council translators queued and ready. It transmits automatically on his signal or on mine. It does not require us to be in communication. The secondary package was the Sonori documentation, the resonance operations, the medical records, the full account of what had been done to Oruru Salith's predecessor and the 2 Thiel delegates before him. We had decided it would only move if the Sonori intervened actively during the session. Using it as an opening move would have been efficient but potentially unpredictable. The Sonori had methods that went beyond council procedure. We had determined that if they were going to be exposed, the exposure needed to come as a response to their own action, not as an attack. Fleet, I said. Lena confirmed 8 minutes ago. All 12 vessels in configured active standby. Disruptors live in holding. No alerts on any station sensor channel. No traffic control inquiries. Station security is running its normal morning shift rotation and has no elevated alert status. I picked up all 6 data chips and put them in my inside jacket pocket. They sat against my chest, light as paper, heavy as everything we had built. We walked to the chamber, all 6 together in a row, through the corridor from the human annex to the main hall. We passed 2 Vorith administrative clerks who did not look up from their screens. We passed a small group of Sonori attaches who stopped their conversation as we went by, let us pass, and resumed immediately. I noted the pause. It was not unusual for the Sonori to be cautious around unknown variables. We had been an unknown variable in that corridor for 11 years. What was slightly unusual was the quality of the pause, something more attentive than their typical reflexive caution. Nora noticed it too, I knew, because she adjusted her walking pace by a fraction of a step, which was her signal. The chamber was already at full attendance when we entered. This was the first indication that the session had been circulated internally with more detail than the official notice. Suggested sessions at full delegate strength on a single unspecified agenda item meant that the content had been communicated through back channels to people who were not supposed to know about it yet. The Voreth had told their allies, the allies had told their senior staff, the senior staff had pulled their delegations to full complement to be present for whatever was about to be officially announced, or a seeth of the delegation was watching the chamber entrance when our row of 6 came through the door, not watching the door, generally watching us specifically with the focused and unguarded attention that his species reserved for significant events. I met his eyes for less than a second and looked away. We took our seats on the floor, the identification band pressed against my wrist, veiled. Dorothy opened the session with his standard economy, no introduction, no acknowledgement of the unusual attendance, as if arriving at a packed chamber for an unspecified agenda item were completely normal, which for him it probably was. He cited the standard procedural opening language and moved immediately to the agenda item which had been listed in the short notice circulation as observer status review. General provisions. He proceeded through it with the patient thoroughness of a person who has given many presentations on subjects they consider simple. He cited 3 provisions of the Council Foundation Charter. He noted the findings from the Vesta 7 review. He summarized the Colonial Affairs Review Board report. He outlined the mechanism by which the Council could formally initiate a reclassification review of any observer status designation. Then he invited the Council members to speak to the question. 2 Voreth delegates offered remarks in support of the review process. Their language was careful and procedural and entirely bloodless. Muir and Block said nothing. The Dravathi studied their data screens. The Soli held very still. The KTH were present and silent. Then Vale Dorothy invited written submissions from the observer seat, noting as a formality that the human delegation could submit a formal response within 60 standard days. The tone of the invitation made clear that this was a procedural courtesy extended to furniture. We could write a letter 2 months which would be logged in, would serve as documentation that the process had been conducted with appropriate notice. I stood up, not because I was addressed, not because it was my turn, not because anyone in that chamber expected me to stand. I stood up from my chair on the chamber floor, and the sound of that chair moving in the middle of a formal council session was one of the most silence-creating sounds I had heard in my life, because what followed it was absolute quiet. 2 Voreth security officers on the chamber floor took steps toward me. I spoke. Before they could reach me, I spoke in High Voreth, the formal internal command dialect, using the precise phonemic register that Nora had spent 7 years teaching me, the specific variant that Voreth leadership used for internal communications that no other species was supposed to understand, the same dialect Vale Dorothy had used 40 minutes before the previous session when he had said what he had said. I said in Voreth with no preamble and no apology. Chancellor Vale Dorothy, I am placing a formal challenge to this proceeding under Article 19 of the Council Foundation Compact on the grounds of procedural fraud, coercive voting governance, and violations of the neural autonomy conventions as ratified in the 5th Council charter, the security officer. Stop, the chamber was still veiled. Doroth's golden eyes were on me. He had not moved, he had not gestured, but something had changed in his posture, in the specific way that things change, in the posture of a person who has just encountered a variable they did not account for. He was recalibrating, not alarmed, recalibrating. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen him do. He responded in the same dialect. This was significant because responding in kind meant accepting implicitly and on the record that this was a legitimate formal exchange. He asked with careful procedural formality what evidence I claimed supported such a challenge. 11 years of it, I said, in your language, in your own words, from your own secured communication systems. I reached into my jacket and produced one of Philip's data chips, and I will read every document on this chip in this chamber before I sit down. I set the chip on the podium. Then I reached up with my right hand and touched the left side of my jacket collar in the space outside the station. 12 vessels in active standby configuration made a final small adjustment. Their gravity disruptors aligned with the jump corridor exit points, not aimed at the station, not threatening anyone aboard it, but positioned in the precise geometric configuration that any fleet intelligence officer would recognize as a lock, and from which no fleet could depart without passing through gravitational field that would strip navigation from their drives. Lena confirmed in my earpiece 4 seconds later. Clean, no alarm, no sensor response. The station was doing exactly what it always did on a Tuesday morning. I turned back to the chamber and I began. I spoke for 2 hours and 14 minutes without pausing more than a breath between sections. I worked through the dossier and the order Philip and I had designed over 6 months of careful preparation, building from the material that was serious but manageable toward the material that was serious and structural. I began with the financial instruments embedded in the Murin fuel corridor agreements. I read the documents aloud in standard council speech and in Morin native language rendering. I read the 17 session cross reference showing the correspondence between VOR financial transfers and Murin block votes. I did not editorialize. I did not characterize. I read the documents spoke for themselves. The Murin lead delegate had gone completely still. She was reading the Murin language text on her own screen. The translation Philip had prepared with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between a translation a delegate would accept and one they would dispute was often a single word. She was reading it with a particular focused quiet of a person who is encountering something they have suspected for a long time and hoped was not true and has now been shown that it is. I moved to the Drevi patent applications, the 27 instances of Vorith administrative interference documented in meticulous detail, the routing mechanisms used to delay Dravathia applications long enough for Vorith aligned corporations to file competing claims in the new licensing zones. I had the internal communications between Vorath administrative officials discussing specific applications by name. I read the names. I read what had been said about them and what had been decided. The Dravathi lead delegate, Aaron Soth, a person who had served on this council for 20 years and who I had never once seen betray any emotion in formal session, was gripping the edge of his desk with both of his primary hands. not in anger or not only in anger in the specific physical expression of someone who has waited a long time to have something confirmed and is now sitting with the weight of its confirmation. I presented the Vora threat assessment. Falsifications. The documents showing that the evaluations used to justify outer corridor access had been written to predetermine conclusions that the security concerns cited in denial decisions, including the one handed to Vesta 7, had been fabricated by the same administrative unit whose communications I now read aloud in their original language with the original timestamps, with the names of the officials who had signed the final versions. 3 Vorith. Delegates of the top tier shifted in their seats, 2 of the junior Vorith. Administrative staff in the gallery above had gone very still in the way that people go stilled where their private communications are being read aloud in a room full of the people. Those communications were written to manipulate. Then I said that I wanted to address the matter of the fleet currently positioned outside the station. The chamber's quality of attention changed again, deepened and sharpened in a way I felt more than heard. I activated the display feed from Lena's monitoring panel, and the live positions of the 12 vessels appeared on the chamber's main screen. Their gravitational configurations clear, their alignment with the jump corridors. Precise real-time data, not a claim, a fact on a screen. These vessels have been in position for 9 days. I said they were placed there under the authority of Earth's government. They are under Earth's military command. They are not aimed at anything on the station. They have not targeted any person or system. Here, I want the record to be entirely clear on that point. I paused. What they represent is also something I want the record to be clear on. Earth is not a species that lacks the ability to respond to what has been done to us. Across 4 decades of council membership, we are a species that chose not to respond. There is a difference between a species that cannot act and a species that has spent 40 years deciding when and how and whether to act. We chose patience. We chose learning. We chose to sit in chairs on the floor of this chamber and document everything we saw, while the people who put us in those chairs assumed we were not worth watching. Another pause. We watched. Today the patience ends, not the peace. The patience. The chamber was quiet enough to hear the ventilation system. If this council proceeds with the reclassification process for the human observer designation, Earth will simultaneously withdraw from every council-administered agreement and will invite each member species here to negotiate bilateral frameworks directly, without VOR mediation or approval. I kept my voice level, and even if my delegation is removed from the station, everything I have presented today will be transmitted to every inhabited system in council space within the hour. I looked at the chamber slowly, taking in each delegation in turn. If this council would like to adjourn for 4 hours, read the documentation I have submitted, and then hold an honest vote on the question of whether the reclassification process should continue, I will sit down and wait. I sat down. 6 seconds of silence. Then Oraru Salith of the Thiel delegation stood in the clipped formal speech of his species without preface. Without diplomatic softening, he said that the Thiel delegation seconded the call for a recess and a full review of the submitted evidence. Aaron Sothov, the Drevathi, stood and said the same. His voice was steady and careful, but it carried something beneath the steadiness that everyone in that chamber who had known him for any time at all could hear, something that had been waiting a very long time to be present in a formal session. One of the sole delegates, in a voice so small I almost lost it in the translation feed, said that they agreed. Veiled Dorath called the recess. He did not speak to anyone on the chamber floor. He did not look at the human delegation. He stood, straightened the plates across his shoulders, and walked toward the exit at the top tier. He did not look at me. I picked up my data chip from the podium, walked back to my chair on the floor, and sat down. The band was still on my wrist. I turned it once. Slowly, Callum at the far end of our row made a note on his pad, and then, in a voice quiet enough for only me to hear, said, "That was 11 years. Yes," I said. "Worth it." I thought about 40,000 people on Vesta 7. I thought about the notification they had received, formatted in bureaucratic language, telling them their petition was denied for reasons of stability management. Ask me after the vote, I said. The vote, when it came 3 and 2 hours later, was 11-2. The 2 were Voreth and Sorai. The 11 were everyone else. The Moran lead delegate voted with the majority in silence, without drama, with the expression of a person crossing a line they have been standing at for years and finally stepping over it. The Devathai voted in the same silence. The Soli voted with visible relief. The Thial voted with the weight of a delegation that knows exactly what a vote costs and has chosen to pay it. And the KTH lead delegate stood before voting and spoke in open session for the first time 6 years in a language requiring 3 translators in relay to render, and said simply that enough was enough. The reclassification process was terminated. The evidence entered permanently into the official council record. A motion raised by the Thiel delegation for the formation of a procedural review committee with equal representation from all member species passed 11-2. Veiled Dorath left before the session formally closed. Outside the station, 12 vessels quietly began reconfiguring from active standby back to standard orbit. No announcement, no ceremony, just 12 ships doing what ships do when the specific thing they were therefore is finished. The Vorathro junior adage who approached me in the corridor afterward was young, her shoulder plate still a lighter shade than her seniors. She stood in front of me and said carefully, "How does a species survive 40 years of being treated with contempt without becoming contemptible itself?" I looked at her for a moment. "You refuse to let yourself forget what it feels like," I said, "not as a wound you carry around, as a reference, because the moment you stop being able to remember what contempt costs the person receiving it, you stop being able to recognize when you are delivering it." She thought about this. Then she said her name was Sebath, that she had been assigned to the procedural review committee as an administrative liaison, and that she hoped the human delegation's representative would be available for consultation. I told her I would make time for it. Owen came into my office that evening without knocking, which he only did when it was late and the work was finished, and set a cup of coffee on my desk without being asked, which he had never done before. He sat in the chair across from me and looked at the wall for a while. "They will not let this rest," he said. "No, the Vorith will work through back channels probably within 2 years. Are you worried?" I thought about the vote. I thought about Orusilith's predecessor and his family who had been told it was age. I thought about Seveth asking her question. In the corridor, I am appropriately concerned, I said, which is different from worried. We sat in the quiet for a while, the two of us, and for the first time in 11 years, the quiet did not require surviving. The identification band was still on my wrist. I had not yet taken it off. Some things should be carried a while longer before you decide what to do with them. I turned it once, slowly. Then I picked up my pen and wrote everything down. The 4-hour recess had not been quiet for anyone. I had spent most of it in the sub-deck with Owen and Nora and Philip, watching the sensor feeds, watching the communication traffic, watching the gravitational readouts from the fleet positions, watching the 12 different indicators that told us how the station around us was responding to what had just happened in the chamber. The Vorith internal traffic had elevated significantly in the first 30 minutes. Philip tracked it without alarm. The encryption levels had not gone to emergency protocols, which meant that, despite the unexpected nature of the session's development, the Vorath leadership had not yet moved into crisis response mode. They were assessing. They were having the conversations that senior leadership has when a prepared script has been replaced by an unscripted situation, and everyone involved needs to agree on what the new situation actually is before they can decide how to respond. The Murin had transmitted to their home world. The message was 3 times their usual length, which Lena calculated against their historical communication patterns and identified as consistent with a government seeking instruction rather than simply reporting events. The Murin delegates were asking their government what to do. This was telling because delegations that have firm standing orders do not ask, they report. The fact that the Murin were asking meant their standing orders no longer covered the situation they were in. The Dravasi had sent 2 brief messages to an address Philip identified as corresponding to a commercial representative's office on neutral station, 4 formatted in government standard encoding, brief messages in government encoding to a commercial address meant back channels, which every species in the council had and used and officially did not acknowledge. What was interesting about all of this was not the detail but the pattern. Every species that had been voting with the Vorath out of managed obligation rather than genuine alignment was now in the course of a single 4-hour recess in consultation with their own governments about whether the alignment was still viable. The chain that had held the council's voting bloc together for 30 years was not made of agreement. It was made of calculation, and the calculation had just acquired a significant new variable. I was thinking about this when Callum's voice came through the earpiece. He was still near the chamber monitoring corridor movement. He told me that Oraru Saleth of the delegation had requested a direct communication with our delegation through the formal ATOSH channel and wanted 15 minutes before the session resumed. Owen said, take it before I could decide. He was right, so I took it. Or Saleth came to a small side room off the main corridor, the kind of unremarkable space that existed throughout the station for informal exchanges that both parties wanted off the main traffic routes. He arrived alone. The call diplomatic protocol. Almost always we required paired attendance. He had decided this Conversation did not require protocol. He stood across the small table from me and looked at me in the particular way his species looked at things they were deciding about. His eyes were large and reflective, designed by evolution for a range of light conditions very different from the station's standard settings. And in the corridor light they caught everything. You prepared that for a long time, he said. Yes, the documents on the field delegates, he said. He paused in a way that was not about finding words. It was about deciding how to carry what the words contained. Those three names, the ones who retired, I knew exactly which records he meant. Yes, one of them was my predecessor. He served 21 years. He was a careful diplomat. He was not a fragile person. When he retired early, he told me his health had declined. He told me he was tired. I believed him, because the work is genuinely tiring and because I had no reason not to believe him. He stopped. He died 4 years after he left the council. His family was told it was a neurological condition, age-related. I did not fill the silence. That is not what it was, he said. Not a question. No, I said. The medical documentation is complete. I can provide a direct copy to you for his family if you want it. Oraru Salith held very still for a moment. Then he said, what do you actually want from this session? Not the political architecture. What do you want? It was a precise question and a rare one. Most diplomats ask about positions. Most ask about offers and conditions and what is acceptable and what is not. They do not often ask what you actually want, because what you actually want is considered personal information in a professional context, and most professionals are careful about that boundary. Oraru Salith had chosen to ignore the boundary, which told me something important about how he was approaching this particular conversation. I want the mechanism to be visible permanently, I said, not just disrupted for one session. I want every species in that chamber to be able to see on the official record how their votes have been directed and by whom and why. After that, what they do with that visibility is their business. And Earth wants what 40,000 people on Vesta 7 wanted: the right to operate in the corridor we petitioned for under our own governance without being told our existence is a stability risk that is smaller than I expected. He said, the small thing is the honest thing. I said, the political restructuring is real, but it is a result. The actual want is the small one. He considered this for a moment. The soul will follow us, he said. Then they are afraid, but they have been afraid of choosing the wrong side for longer than they have been afraid of the Vorath. Specifically, if we move in the vote, they will move with us. The KTH. I asked. He made a small gesture I could not fully read. They came to this session with their full delegation. They have not done that in 6 years. We stood in the small, unremarkable room for a few more seconds. 2 people from 2 species who had both been sitting on the floor of that chamber in different ways for different lengths of time, and then Oraru Salith turned to leave and paused at the door. The 12 vessels, he said, without turning back. Was the fleet actually operational, or was it always a demonstration only? I did not consider lying. This was not a room or a moment for it. It was operational, I said. If the session had gone differently, I had authorization to use it. It was not a bluff. He nodded, the nod of someone who has confirmed something they needed to confirm before they could go forward. Not comfortable with the answer, but clear. Then he left. I stood in the small room alone for a moment. Then I walked back to the subdeck, told Philip and Owen and Nora what the conversation had contained, and we spent the remaining hour of the recess checking every element once more, not because anything was uncertain, but because this was the kind of work where checking again was not redundancy, but respect for the stakes. The vote was 11-2. I walked back to the annex through corridors that were the same corridors they had always been, lit at the same frequency, calibrated for the same eyes. That had always been considered the default here. I sat at my desk and opened my log for the first time in hours and looked at the blank page. Every entry for 11 years had begun the same way, the date and then the quality of the silence that day, the particular texture of what it meant to be present in a place that did not consider you present. I had developed without fully intending to an entire vocabulary for grades and qualities of silence. I did not have that vocabulary tonight. I wrote, we voted today. That was enough. The rest was already written, 11 years of it in every entry before this one. The record was there for anyone who wanted to know what it had cost and how long it had taken and what the silence had actually felt like from inside it. I put down my pen and sat with a quiet for a while. Then I reached up and for the first time took the identification band off my wrist. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk and closed the drawer. Not thrown away, not ceremonially destroyed, filed, because the record mattered, and this was part of the record. And I was not yet sure what to do with all of it, and I had learned that the things you are not yet sure about deserve to stay close until you understand them. Philip pulled up the Sonori communication analyses on the side screen while I was still processing what I had told Orusalith. The Sonori had been notably quiet in terms of external transmission since the session had broken for recess. This was itself information. Species under pressure either increase their communication traffic as they seek guidance and share assessments, or they decrease it as they focus internally and decide things in closed rooms. Theory decreasing their external traffic meant they were deciding internally, and deciding internally meant that what they decided was unlikely to emerge until they had a clear position. The question was what that position would be. The Sonori's exposure in the dossier was partial. I had presented documents that showed the Vorith had known about and tacitly approved the resonance operations. I had not yet deployed the secondary package that detailed the operations themselves. The Sonori knew the partial presentation had happened. They did not know whether the full documentation existed. They were almost certainly calculating whether they should act on the assumption that it did. I hoped they would conclude that it did. I hoped they would sit in their closed room and weigh the cost of acting against the cost of staying still, and choose staying still, because staying still was the correct choice for them, and the correct choice for the session's outcome, and the correct choice for the 11 species in that chamber who had spent varying numbers of years under the quiet pressure of knowing someone could reach into their thinking without permission. They chose staying still. I learned this not from a transmission or a sensor reading, but from Nora, who had been monitoring the Senzori delegations posture through the chambers observation feed during the full 4 hours of the recess. She came to find me 40 minutes before the session was scheduled to resume and said without sitting down that the Senior lead delegate had been in the chamber for the past 2 hours, not at her tier in the chamber itself at floor level reading the documentation on a portable screen alone without any aid or attaché present. This was unusual. It was unusual because Senior leadership did not typically put themselves in physically exposed positions in contested environments, reading classified documentation at floor level, in an empty chamber where anyone could observe them and where the symbolism of the physical position was as significant as anything they might read was the behavior of a person who had decided that something needed to be understood before anything else happened. It was also the behavior of a person who did not want anyone from their own delegation to see them reading it. I thought about this for a long time. The Senior lead delegate was a being named Solon, who had been on the council for 18 years and who had in those 18 years been involved in every significant vote affecting the balance of power in the chamber. She was not a secondary figure making secondary decisions. She was the center of a very old and very carefully maintained structure, and she was sitting alone on the chamber floor reading documents that detailed what that structure had been built on and maintained by. I could not know what she was thinking. I could observe what she was doing, and what she was doing was the behavior of a person who has encountered an accounting they were not prepared for and has decided to sit with it honestly before deciding what to do next. Nora said nothing else about it. She did not need to. She had told me what she saw. What I did with what she saw was my decision, and we both understood that without needing to discuss it. What I did with it was nothing. I did not modify the secondary package. I did not signal Owen to delay or accelerate anything. I simply noted in my private log later that evening that 8th Solon had sat on the floor of the chamber for 2 hours reading the documentation alone, and that this was something worth knowing. Some things you record and do not yet act on because the acting will come later, and the record is what makes the acting possible when it does. The session resumed at the scheduled time. The Senior delegation took their seats in their tier. 8th Solon's expression was, as it always was, carefully composed. She did not look at the human delegation's row when she sat down. She looked straight ahead at the podium, at the chamber, at the architecture of a place she had been coming to for 18 years. She did not attempt a resonance operation during the vote. Neither did anyone else. The vote passed, and the corridor afterward was where Seveth found me and asked her question, and I gave her the only honest answer I had. Later, after Owen had come and gone and the coffee was cold and the log entry was finished, I sat in my office and thought about what came next. Not the procedural review committee, though that was real and important and already scheduled. Not the bilateral framework discussions, though those were real and important and already begun. Not the fleet repositioning or the shell company dissolution or the 3 dozen administrative items that needed to happen in a specific order over the next 60 days. I thought about what it meant to have been the person in those chairs for 11 years and to now be the person in a different kind of chair, and whether the person who survived the first kind of chair was equipped to occupy the second kind of chair with the right combination of competence and humility. I did not have a clean answer to that. I wrote it in the log as an open question, because open questions in the log meant I was not pretending to certainty I did not have, and not pretending to certainty I did not have was one of the more important habits I had maintained over 11 years of sitting in a room that had every incentive to make me doubt myself. I was not finished being the kind of person I had needed to be. Those chairs, I was simply being that person in a different chair now. That was, I decided, probably enough to work with. I went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 3 weeks and slept until morning. 6 months later, the lights in the docking bay were fixed. This sounds small, it is small, but I had submitted 3 formal maintenance requests for those lights over 14 years and received 3 formal acknowledgments of receipt and 3 subsequent silences that stretched until each request was administratively closed as expired. The 4th request had been approved in 48 hours. The maintenance crew arrived the next morning. I wrote in my log that morning, the lights in the docking bay, 14 years, 2 sentences. Sometimes the record is its own commentary. The main chamber had changed more substantially. The tiered seating was still in place because the chamber's architecture was old and full. Reconstruction was expensive and complex, but the observation seat row had been removed. In its place at the same level as the Thickle and Murin and Dravathi sections, a new tier had been installed, 6 proper seats with full voting console access and a secure communication relay independently verified by 3 separate technical teams before installation. The human delegation now sat in the chamber in it properly with desks and consoles and the right to press a button that would register our vote in the official count. I had not yet fully adjusted to having a desk in front of me during sessions. 11 years of expecting to have to stand had left something in my body that had not quite caught up with the changed reality. The identification bands had been formally abolished in the 2nd week by an emergency procedural resolution passed 13-0 with the Vorath abstaining. The Vorath abstention was deliberate and calculated. It preserved the form of their opposition without requiring them to take an indefensible public position against a measure the entire rest of council had already agreed to. I had predicted this exact response when writing my preparation notes 8 months before the session. The Vorath were very good at preserving form when substance was no longer available to them. I wore my band for 1 week after the resolution passed. Then I took it off, put it in a small case, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk in the annex, not as a statement, not as ceremony, simply because some things should not be thrown away. Something should exist somewhere in a drawer as a fact about what happened and what it cost and what it was eventually worth. Nora's paper had been in its 4th draft for 3 weeks and would probably go through 2 more before she was satisfied with it. 430 pages on Vorath linguistic history with a central argument that required her to have read material in 14 different archival languages and to have synthesized it without anyone in those 14 linguistic traditions having done the synthesis before her. The core finding was this: the Vorath had not always been the dominant species, using the mechanisms of dominance to stay dominant. They had once been subject to something very like what they had spent centuries doing to others, the memory of That subjugation had been processed and transformed through generations into the political culture that produced Vale, Doreth and his predecessor, and the entire apparatus of contempt that I had sat inside for 11 years. The contempt was not natural to them. It was not inherent. It was a response to injury, reshaped so many times across so many generations that the people carrying it had completely lost the connection between the original wound and the behavior it had eventually become. I had found this when Nora first showed me the early drafts deeply uncomfortable. Not because it excused anything. It did not excuse anything. What had been done to the Thial delegates, what had been done to Vesta 7, what had been done to the Dravathi and the Muron and every other species that had spent decades under the quiet management of Vath. Administrative power, none of that was made smaller or less real by the history behind it, but it complicated the simple story, and I had learned to distrust simple stories, including the ones in which my own species was entirely in the right and the species across from us was entirely without explanation. Understanding was not forgiveness, but it was the precondition of anything that lasted. When Nora's paper was published in the Council's academic record, it did not make the Voreth popular. It made them legible in a new way, and legibility was the beginning of something that was not hatred, and that was enough for now. Sebeth had read every draft. She had become, in the 6 months since the session, one of the most effective informal bridge builders I had encountered in my career, operating from inside the Voreth reform movement with a combination of internal credibility and external alignment that was genuinely rare in any political system. The reform movement had existed for years in a kind of tolerated internal exile, too visible to suppress cleanly but too small to matter. The dossier had changed both of those conditions simultaneously. She sat across from me on a quiet Tuesday in the Thiel reception room, drinking something warm her species preferred, reading a document on her screen, and said without looking up that the Chancellor replacement vote had concluded and the announcement would come within the week. Veal Hearth, she said, his son, yes, he is not his father. That is not always sufficient. I said, no, but it is more than nothing. She looked up. He has asked for an informal meeting with your delegation, not council official. Unlogged, he would like to simply have a conversation. I thought about this. New Voreth Chancellor seeking an informal conversation with the human ambassador, not demanding, not summoning, asking, and willing to wait. Tell him 2 weeks, I said. We have something first. The something first was the Dulhari. They had been detected 8 weeks earlier by a Thiel Longgrain survey probe operating in the outer edge of the neutral zone, a warm planet with a single star, complex atmospheric chemistry, a biosphere with significant mass and electromagnetic signals, consistent with early industrial development, not space capable, not yet aware in the way that awareness has specific meaning in this context, that anything outside their system existed and was watching. The Colonial Affairs Review Board had opened a contact preparation file within 48 hours of the Thiel survey report being formally submitted. Standard procedure. 36 days later, the board had produced a preliminary classification recommendation, Tier 4 pre-emergent observer track identification ban, protocol pending confirmation of contact, method. I had read the recommendation in my inbox and sat with it for 20 minutes. Then I had opened my scheduling system and sent meeting invitations to Oruru, Salith to Aaron Sooth of the Drevathi to Hesamir, who had been elected to lead the Murin block 4 weeks after the original vote in what was described as a routine succession and was in fact an unambiguous signal about what the Murin people expected from their council representation going forward. And to Savith, we met in the procedural review committee's new meeting space, which had been designed from the start for equal-sized chairs and neutral lighting, calibrated for a mid-range that worked reasonably well for all 6 species in the room. And we talked about the Dulhari for 2 hours. The conversation produced a motion filed by the Thiel delegation, seconded by the human delegation, co-sponsored by Dravathian, Murin and Soli and Karat. The motion called for immediate revision of the first contact classification framework, not the abolition of the tier system, which was a larger restructuring than a single motion could accomplish. Specific targeted revision: any newly contacted species upon confirmed first contact would receive a provisional full seat in the council, pending an orientation process jointly designed by all member species with technical and economic support programs attached, with no identification requirements and with a formal statement of welcome from the council as a whole. The Dulhari would be greeted as members. The motion session was the largest in attendance I had seen in my career, full delegations at every tier, the observers' gallery at capacity. For the first time in years, corridor conversation before the session had the specific quality of conversation that happens before something everyone knows matters. The acting Vorith chair Vale Kurth sat in the top tier and watched. He did not speak during the open debate period, which lasted 40 minutes and included remarks from 8 different delegations. He did not move to oppose the motion procedurally or substantively. When the vote came, he pressed the abstain indicator on his console with the same composed deliberateness with which the Voreth consistently abstained from things they could not oppose cleanly. 2 votes against 114. The KTH delegate stood before voting and spoke for the second time in 6 months in open session and said only, "We remember what it was to arrive." The motion passed. I read the formal language into the official record from the podium as the sponsoring delegation's lead representative. Procedural role, standard requirement. Not a speech. I stood at that podium and thought about the first time I had stood at it uninvited in a room that had not expected to hear what I said, wearing a numbered band on my wrist. I thought about the chair on the floor that was not there anymore. I thought about the petition from Vesta 7. The Vesta 7 mining rights application had been approved in the 3rd week after the original vote, processed in 48 hours, logged in the system as a routine approval. The notification had come through the Brit channel, formatted in standard bureaucratic language, as if it had always been heading toward approval and had simply needed time to arrive. I had read it in my office and then printed it out and given it to Philip, with a note that said, "Frame this." He had hung it on the wall of the subject deck below the gravitational map, and it was still there. White paper in a simple frame, the most ordinary document on the wall of a room that held some of the most significant operational records in the history of Earth's presence in Council space. I read the motion into the record and walked back to my seat. Callum was beside me as always. He had turned 29 3 weeks ago and had been emphatic about not wanting acknowledgement of this fact during working hours, which I had respected by ensuring there was a very good cake in the annex kitchen that evening, most of which he had consumed himself while maintaining the fiction that he had not expected it. He leaned over as I sat down. The Secretary General's shuttle arrived in dock 37 20 minutes ago. I looked at him. She wanted to be here for the vote, he said. She did not tell you because she was correct that you would tell her it was not necessary. She had been on the station once before for the first formal meeting of the Procedural Review Committee. That visit had an agenda. This one had no agenda. She had come to sit in a gallery and watch a vote pass in a chamber that 40 years ago had classified humanity as furniture. With opinions, I stayed in my seat while the session closed around me, while the chamber emptied delegation by delegation, until the last few people with no particular reason to hurry had finished gathering their things and gone. Then I was alone in the chamber in a proper seat with a desk and a console, the voting record for this session showing my name in the official count alongside 11 others. The ceiling was transparent. Through it, the stars moved in their slow arcs, the galaxy's arm curving in long white ribbons across the dark with the patience of things that do not measure time the way we do. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the identification band. I had carried it with me every day since I removed it from my wrist, not as sentiment as the specific kind of reminder that you carry, not to punish yourself but to stay honest, a small physical record of what had been real, so that when the memory of it started to soften with distance, the way memories soften, there was something that did not soften. I held it in my hand and looked at it, a 6-digit code, my number, the council's efficient way of communicating without words, where we belonged. I thought about the 40 years that had preceded my 11 humans who had come before me to sessions like this one and had sat in chairs on the floor and worn bands on their wrists and had said nothing and absorbed everything and gone home and written in their logs and come back the next day and done it again because the calculation was correct and the timing was not yet right, and patience was the only available form of integrity in those years. I thought about Oruru, Seelith's predecessor, 21 years of careful service and a neurological condition that was not neurological. His family who had believed the report they were given because there was no reason not to believe it, and because the alternative required knowing things that had been carefully made unknowable. I thought about Sebeth asking how a species survives contempt without becoming contemptible. I thought about Nora's 430 pages and the original wound behind the weapon. I thought about the Dulhari on their warm planet sending signals into the dark that they did not yet know were being received, building their roads and their cities and their ideas about what was out there, preparing without knowing they were preparing for the moment when they would find out. And I thought about what it would mean for them to arrive in this chamber and find no row of chairs on the floor and no numbered band waiting for their wrist. Someone had needed to make that true before they arrived. Someone had needed to do the specific, uncomfortable work of sitting in those chairs and wearing those bands for long Enough and in the right way and building. The right things in the right sequence. So that when the moment came, the moment would be what it needed to be. We had done that. It had cost what it cost, and it had been worth exactly what it was. Worth, which was not a small amount. I put the identification band back in my pocket, not throwing it away, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some records should not be put away too quickly. Some weights should be carried not as punishment but as the specific kind of memory that keeps you honest. I opened my log, sitting alone in the chamber with the stars moving overhead, and I wrote the entry that had been forming in various versions in the back of my mind. For 6 months, the one I had not been ready to write until now. Earth remained silent because we were not ready, and because we were wise enough to know it. We spoke when we were. The galaxy listens now. That is not a boast, it is a burden we chose to carry because someone had to, and we had spent 40 years learning how. I closed the law. I stood. I straightened my jacket the same way I had straightened it every morning for 11 years before walking into the chamber. And I walked out to find the secretary general. The lights in the corridor were still calibrated for Voreth eyes. The same frequency that made everything slightly too sharp in the red register for human vision. The same lights that had been in this corridor since before humanity had a seat in the room beyond it. We had not yet addressed the corridor lights. We had a list. The list was long and specific and organized by priority and assigned to the relevant people on the procedural review committee. The lights were toward the middle, below the medical technology exchange revisions, and above the docking bay assignment protocols. They would be addressed in their turn. That was the thing about the work. It was not finished because the vote had passed. It was not finished because the bands were off and the chairs were replaced and the dossier was in the permanent record, and the Murin had elected a new block chair, and the Dravathi were filing technology applications without administrative interference for the first time in 30 years. The vote was a beginning of something, not an end of something, and everyone on our team understood this with the clarity that comes from having spent enough years understanding that beginnings are harder than endings, because endings have a shape and beginnings only have a direction. We had the direction. The corridor lights would wait their turn on the list. I walked through them toward the docking bay, toward the shuttle where the secretary general was waiting, and I let the slightly wrong frequency of light fall across my face the way it always had. And I did not mind it. We had a list. We had time. We would get there.